You think the Civil War started with a cannon shot in Charleston Harbor? You're wrong. The first real blood wasn't spilled by soldiers in uniform facing each other across a battlefield. It was spilled on a city street, in a chaotic, vicious street fight. Just 1 week after Fort Sumter, the war was almost over. The capital, Washington, D.C., was completely cut off, surrounded, and helpless. Abraham Lincoln was a president trapped in his own capital, unable to call for help. The Union was about to be decapitated before it could even raise an army. And it all came down to one city, one riot, and one of the most brutal, legally questionable decisions any American president has ever made.
To understand how close the Union came to collapsing, you have to understand Baltimore in 1861. It wasn't just a city, it was the geographical choke point for the entire Union war effort. Every single railroad from the industrial North, the source of all soldiers and supplies, had to pass through Baltimore to reach Washington. There was no other way. And Baltimore was a city with a divided soul, but a very loud, very angry pro-Southern heart. They called it Mobtown for a reason. Its political leaders, its police chief, and a huge portion of its citizens sympathized deeply with the Confederacy. They saw the incoming Union soldiers not as saviors, but as foreign invaders crossing their sovereign state of Maryland to wage war on their Southern brothers. So when Lincoln put out the call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, it wasn't a call to arms for Baltimore, it was a declaration of war. The city was a powder keg, and the first Union regiments were the lit match. The first to answer Lincoln's call were men from Massachusetts, the 6th Massachusetts Militia. They were factory workers, clerks, and farmers, barely trained and utterly unprepared for what was coming. As their train moved south, they were greeted as heroes. In New York, in Philadelphia, enormous crowds cheered them on, waving flags, offering food. They must have felt like crusaders. But they had been warned. Rumors were swirling that Baltimore would not let them pass. The regiment's commander, Colonel Edward Jones, ordered his men to load their weapons before they even reached the city. On the morning of April 19th, exactly 1 week after Sumter's surrender, their train rolled into Baltimore's President Street station. The cheering was gone. In its place was a low murmur, a growing crowd of thousands of Baltimore citizens. Their faces were not friendly. They weren't holding Union flags. They were holding rocks, bricks, and secessionist banners. The welcome party was over. The problem was a quirk of Baltimore's railway system. To get to Washington, the troops had to get from the President Street station to the Camden station, about a mile away on the other side of the city center. Normally, the train cars were simply uncoupled, drawn by horses one by one across town, and recoupled to a new engine. But on this day, with this crowd, that 1-mile journey was like crossing a foreign enemy country. The first 7 companies of the 6th Massachusetts made it across in the horse-drawn cars, but the mob was growing, becoming bolder. They threw stones, they blocked the tracks with anchors and sand. Finally, they unhitched the horses from the remaining cars, leaving 4 companies, about 240 men, stranded and surrounded by a sea of thousands of furious citizens. Stranded, their officers made a fateful decision. They would have to march. The 4 companies formed up, fixed bayonets, and began to advance through the narrow city streets. The mob, which now numbered close to 10,000, went berserk. It was a crush of bodies, a cacophony of screams, insults, and threats. "Jeff Davis and the Confederacy," they yelled. Bricks and paving stones rained down on the soldiers. The soldiers, remember, were mostly teenagers. They were terrified, trying to maintain their discipline as men spat on their faces and struck them with clubs. The mayor of Baltimore, George William Brown, bravely marched at the head of the column, pleading with the crowd for calm, but he was powerless to stop the wave of fury. Then a gunshot rang out. A soldier fell, and all discipline broke.
It's impossible to know who fired first, but it didn't matter. Once the first shot was fired, the street erupted into a full-blown battle. The soldiers, panicked and separated, began firing sporadically into the mass of people around them. The mob fired back with pistols they had brought. It was a brutal, ugly, close-quarters fight. This wasn't a battle line, it was a brawl. Men were beaten, stabbed, and shot from windows above. The soldiers were no longer a cohesive unit. They were a terrified mob themselves, fighting for their lives. Their formation shattered. It became a desperate, running fight all the way to Camden Station, with soldiers firing behind them as they ran. When they finally stumbled onto the train, bleeding and battered, they left behind 4 of their own dead and dozens wounded. At least 12 Baltimore civilians lay dead in the streets. This was the first blood, the true start of the Civil War. The riot was over, but Baltimore's rebellion had just begun. That night, under the authority of the mayor and the police marshal, city authorities and secessionist sympathizers took decisive action. They did what the mob couldn't. They systematically destroyed the key railroad bridges north of the city. Then they went for the telegraph lines, cutting every single wire that connected Washington to the rest of the country. In a single night, Baltimore had acted. They had effectively seceded from the Union, and more importantly, had turned the nation's capital into an isolated, helpless island. Imagine being Abraham Lincoln in that moment. You are the President of the United States, sworn to preserve the Union. You've called for an army, but that army can't reach you. The first troops sent to defend you have been attacked, some killed. The telegraph, your only means of instant communication, has gone silent. For days, Washington was a ghost town filled with rumors and terror. Was a Confederate army marching on them from Virginia? Had Maryland officially joined the South? Was the whole country collapsing? Lincoln paced the White House, famously looking out the window towards the unfinished Capitol dome, and lamented to a group of Massachusetts soldiers, "I don't believe there is any North. The 7th Regiment is a myth. Rhode Island is not known in our geography any longer. You are the only northern realities." He was a prisoner in his own capital. The Union needed a savior, and it got one in the most unlikely form, a portly, cross-eyed, and astonishingly ambitious politician turned general named Benjamin Butler. Butler was commanding the 8th Massachusetts, right behind the 6th. When he heard the bridges were burned, he didn't turn back. Butler was a lawyer. He thought in terms of loopholes and leverage, not just military tactics. He realized that if he couldn't go through Baltimore, he would go around it. He seized a ferry boat, loaded his men, and sailed down the Chesapeake Bay to Annapolis, the capital of Maryland. It was a bold, improvisational move that no one in Washington had ordered, and it would change everything. Annapolis was in chaos. The pro-secessionist governor of Maryland tried to forbid Butler from landing his troops. Butler essentially ignored him. He landed his men, secured the U.S. Naval Academy, and then turned his attention to his real objective, the railroad that ran from Annapolis to Washington. It was a single, decrepit track, and the locals had sabotaged the only locomotive. This is where Butler's Massachusetts men proved their worth. They weren't just soldiers, they were mechanics and engineers from the most industrialized state in the nation. Within hours, they had the old engine repaired and the tracks cleared. They had single-handedly opened a new artery into the nation's capital. On April 25th, the 1st Relief Troops, the 7th New York, finally marched into a cheering Washington. Lincoln was so relieved he reportedly wept. The capital was no longer completely isolated. But saving Washington wasn't enough. Lincoln knew he had to solve the Baltimore problem for good. The city was still defiant, a loaded gun pointed at the heart of the Union.
And so, on April 27th, Lincoln made the most constitutionally controversial decision of the entire war. He authorized his generals to suspend the writ of habeas corpus along the military lines from Philadelphia to Washington. What does that mean? Habeas corpus is a cornerstone of American law. It means the government cannot just arrest and imprison someone indefinitely. It has to charge them with a crime and bring them before a judge. By suspending it, Lincoln was giving the Army the power to arrest anyone they deemed a threat, politicians, police chiefs, ordinary citizens, and hold them without trial. He was, in effect, declaring martial law with the stroke of a pen. The man tasked with enforcing this new power was, of course, Benjamin Butler, and he did it with theatrical flair. While the politicians in Washington debated what to do, Butler acted. On the night of May 13th, under the cover of a torrential thunderstorm, he marched about 1,000 men into Baltimore. He didn't engage the city directly. Instead, he occupied Federal Hill, a strategic high point overlooking the entire downtown in the harbor. When the citizens of Baltimore woke up the next morning, they found Union cannons aimed directly at their homes and businesses. It was a silent, powerful message. Defy us again, and we will destroy you. Butler had done this completely without orders, and while he was reprimanded for his audacity, the move was devastatingly effective.
With the city under his cannons, the crackdown began. The Army, now acting with Lincoln's full authority, moved swiftly to neutralize the entire secessionist power structure. They arrested the Baltimore police marshal, George P. Kane, and threw him in a military prison. They arrested numerous pro-Confederate state legislators, effectively preventing the Maryland legislature from even voting on secession. They arrested newspaper editors who were critical of the Union. Anyone suspected of burning the bridges or participating in the riot was rounded up. The city was systematically purged of its Confederate leadership, all without a single charge being filed in a civil court. It was a military occupation of a major American city by the American Army. This did not go unchallenged. One of the men arrested was a Maryland planter named John Merriman. His lawyers went to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger B. Taney, the very same justice who wrote the infamous Dred Scott decision. Taney, a Marylander himself, was furious. He issued a writ of habeas corpus, ordering the military to bring Merriman before his court. The general in command, acting on Lincoln's orders, refused. Taney was powerless. He then wrote a blistering legal opinion, arguing that only Congress, not the President, had the power to suspend the writ, and that Lincoln's actions were unconstitutional and tyrannical. He was legally correct, but Lincoln simply ignored him. It was a stunning constitutional crisis, the President of the United States directly defying a ruling from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Lincoln's position was simple. He would break one law to save all the others. The Union's survival trumped any single constitutional protection. It's easy to see Lincoln's actions as the work of a dictator, but it's also impossible to overstate the stakes. Let's run the scenario. If Lincoln had not acted so ruthlessly, what would have happened? Maryland's pro-secessionist legislature would have almost certainly voted to leave the Union. Washington, D.C., a territory carved out of Maryland and Virginia, would have been completely surrounded by the Confederacy. The capital, with its archives, its legitimacy, and its symbolic power, would have fallen within weeks. Foreign powers like Britain and France, seeing the Union as a lost cause, would have likely recognized the Confederacy. The war would have been over. The United States would have ceased to exist.
Lincoln's cold, brutal calculation was that saving the nation required him to sacrifice, temporarily, one of its most cherished liberties.
The occupation worked. Maryland was secured for the Union, and it would remain a vital staging ground for the rest of the war. But it came at a cost. The state remained deeply divided. Unlike a state like Massachusetts or South Carolina, Maryland had no clear allegiance. It supplied tens of thousands of soldiers to both the Union and Confederate armies. Brothers literally fought against brothers at battles like Antietam, fought on Maryland's own soil. The wounds from the Baltimore Riot and the subsequent military occupation festered for decades. It was a stark reminder that the Civil War wasn't just a war between North and South, but a conflict that ripped individual states, cities, and even families apart from the inside.
The Baltimore Riot of 1861 is often just a footnote in the grand histories of the Civil War, overshadowed by the massive battles to come. But it was arguably one of the most decisive moments of the entire conflict. It was the moment the Union had to confront a terrible truth. The war would not be won with speeches, ideals, or legal arguments alone. It would be won with overwhelming force, strategic ruthlessness, and a willingness to bend the rules to their breaking point. The blood on Pratt Street and Lincoln's subsequent suspension of civil liberties proved that to preserve the government of the people for the people, that government would first have to show it was willing to do whatever it took to survive.
Think about how fast this all happened. 1 week. In just 7 days, the country went from a symbolic, bloodless event at Fort Sumter to a brutal street fight, a severed capital, and a constitutional crisis. This wasn't a slow burn, it was an explosion. The crisis in Maryland forced the Lincoln administration to grow up fast. They had to transition from a peacetime government to a wartime machine in a matter of hours. The initial belief that this would be a short, glorious war died on the cobblestones of Baltimore. The riot revealed the true depth of secessionist feeling and the lengths to which they would go to resist federal authority. It was a wake-up call, demonstrating that holding the Union together would require not just defeating armies in the field, but also suppressing rebellion on the home front.
Let's not forget the individuals caught in this storm. Mayor George William Brown, who personally marched with the troops, trying to keep the peace, only to later authorize the burning of the bridges in a desperate bid to prevent a larger battle within his city. He was a man trying to navigate an impossible situation. Police Marshal George Kane, an avowed secessionist who likely played a role in organizing the resistance and paid for it with his freedom. Colonel Jones, who had to give the order for his young, terrified men to fire into a crowd of American citizens. And of course, Benjamin Butler, the man whose ambition and audacity were perfectly suited for the chaos. He saw the crisis not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. These men, through their choices, brave, foolish, or ruthless, shaped the outcome of this critical first week.
The story of the Baltimore Riot is also a story about infrastructure. In our modern world of highways and instant communication, it's hard to grasp how fragile the nation was. A few burned bridges and cut telegraph wires could paralyze the government. The entire Union war machine depended on a handful of iron rails passing through a hostile city. It shows that wars aren't just fought with soldiers, but with logistics. Benjamin Butler's greatest contribution wasn't a brilliant battlefield tactic, it was finding an alternate supply route. Securing Maryland wasn't just a political victory, it was a logistical necessity. The first campaign of the Civil War wasn't for a fort or a capital, but for control of a railroad junction.
The riot immediately became a propaganda war.
In the North, the soldiers of the 6th Massachusetts were hailed as the first martyrs of the Union cause. Poems were written, songs were sung. The attack solidified Northern resolve and turned Baltimore into a villainous symbol of treason. In the South, the rioters were seen as heroes, patriots defending their homes from an invading army. They saw the soldiers firing into the crowd as a massacre, proof of the North's tyrannical intentions. The event polarized the nation even further, destroying any lingering hope for a peaceful compromise. It drew a line in the sand, and the blood spilled on Pratt Street was used as ink to write the justifications for the much larger war to come.
Lincoln's decision to suspend habeas corpus, while hugely controversial, set a powerful precedent for the expansion of presidential power during wartime. He argued that the president's oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution gave him the inherent authority to take extraordinary measures, even those that seemed to violate other parts of the Constitution, if they were necessary to save the nation itself. This argument has echoed throughout American history. Subsequent presidents, facing their own national crises, have often pointed back to Lincoln's actions in Maryland as a justification for their own expansions of executive authority. The debate that started in a Baltimore courtroom in 1861, the balance between national security and individual liberty, is a debate that we are still having today.
With Maryland locked down and the routes to Washington secured, the Union could finally begin to build its army. The crisis passed. Soon, the war would move to the battlefields of Virginia and beyond. The scale of the fighting would grow to unimaginable levels. The handful of casualties in Baltimore would seem insignificant compared to the tens of thousands who would fall in single days at battles like Antietam and Gettysburg. The street brawl on Pratt Street would be forgotten by many, a chaotic prelude to the main event. But without the swift, brutal, and constitutionally questionable resolution of that prelude, the main event might never have happened. The Union Army might never have been formed, and the war for the nation's soul would have been lost before the first major battle was ever fought. So how do we judge Lincoln's actions? Was he a tyrant who trampled the Constitution to get his way? Or was he a pragmatic statesman who understood that the survival of the entire American experiment was on the line? The truth is, he was probably both. He authorized actions that, in peacetime, would be unthinkable. He chose the preservation of the nation over the rights of individuals he saw as enemies of that nation. The Baltimore Riot presented him with a stark choice: adhere strictly to the law and risk the collapse of the country, or bend the law to save it. He chose the latter. It was the first of many hard, morally gray decisions he would have to make in a war that was full of them. It showed that saving the last best hope of Earth would require more than just high ideals. It would require a will of iron. The story of the Baltimore Riot isn't just a piece of history. It's a case study in power, crisis, and the difficult choices leaders have to make. It reminds us that sometimes the most important moments aren't grand battles, but chaotic street fights and the desperate decisions made in the quiet rooms of power. It all came down to 1 week in April, when a mob on Pratt Street nearly ended the Civil War before it began, and a president had to decide just how far he would go to save the Union. So the question remains, and it's one worth thinking about: was he right? What would you have done? Let me know what you think in the comments below.